Welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on CAN TV. I'm your host, Andy Thayer. With us tonight are two representatives of Gabriela Chicago, Maya Arcilia and Hillary Valenzuela. We're very pleased to have them on the air with us tonight because they're going to be talking about the issue of repression in the Philippines. This is something that probably most Chicagoans, unless you're Filipino American yourself, you probably have not heard about. And so we think it's very, very important to bring it to your audience. Now, you might ask, why is a LGBT organization, the Gay Liberation Network, talking about the situation in the Philippines? For one thing, there's many LGBTs in the Philippines, but more importantly than that, if we're going to have liberation for ourselves, everything that LGBTs need, we need to be in solidarity with those who are also fighting for their freedom, whether LGBT or not. And so the depths of the repression that are going on in the Philippines today are something that we should all be paying attention to and organizing against. And there are things that we can do, and our guest here, I'm sure, will be telling us some of those things. But first, I just want to give a little bit of introduction about the situation in the Philippines, and just get some things up on your screen here. Here we go. So there's the Philippines on your map there. The Philippines, there's 100 million people in the Philippines. There are approximately 10 million people living abroad, in part due to some of the conditions that Maya and Hillary are going to be talking about tonight. And it's very important to be cognizant of that because when people talk about refugees here in this country and so forth, it's often with a great deal of ignorance as to what's actually going on in the countries that they're leaving. Actually, Filipino Americans here in Illinois are the second largest Asian American population in the Chicago area. I believe it's here, 131,000 in the Chicago area. So there's a lot of people in our city who are concerned about what's happening to their loved ones at home. And so that's another reason, obviously, why we should be concerned about. The other issue is the whole issue of the United States colonialism. The Philippines were taken over by the United States during the 1898 Spanish-American War, along with, of course, Cuba and Puerto Rico. But what a lot of people don't know is that something like a couple 100,000 people died because Filipinos were trying to get their own independence. They had just suffered through over 300 years of Spanish domination and thought they finally had the opportunity. And then the Americans came in and, of course, screwed things up. Not unlike in Puerto Rico and Cuba. Mm-hmm. This is a theme. So if you're talking about colonialism, there's probably few areas of the world, aside from the Philippines and other Latin American countries, that have suffered through more centuries of colonialism. And the neocolonialism that you saw with the United States after it took over had a devastating effect. At a rally the other night, I mentioned that one of my formative experiences as a political person was during the Ferdinand Marcos dictatorship. This was a 21-year-long dictatorship. At the beginning of it, the Philippines was the second largest economy in East Asia. But after the literal thefts of the Marcos dictatorship, some $10 billion, and just a situation where no one could get anything done, the Philippines came out of the Marcos dictatorship in 1986 as a basket case. And it really set people in the country behind, and that's why a lot of people had to flee. It was thanks to that U.S. neocolonialism. So this is not just about someplace far away. This is about things that the United States has done through Democratic and Republican administrations. It was during the Johnson administration that the Marcos dictatorship took power, and there was then a coup, essentially, to set up military rule during his presidency. And the Johnson administration knew about it before it even happened. Mm-hmm. Not unlike the Obama administration knowing about the 2009 coup in Honduras. And of course, they didn't do anything about it. They didn't even warn people. And so, as appalled as we are at the horrible things that the Trump administration is doing. We can't just go back to the status quo ante with Democratic administrations doing the same thing with different rhetoric. But I've talked enough, so let's talk to Maya and Arcelia. And there's a great deal of repression going on right now. And a lot of attorneys, a lot of human rights workers, trade unionists, and other organizers are literally being killed. Bring people up to date what's going on with all that.
Sure. So this has been happening for the past 3 years since President Duterte has taken office. So for those of you that don't know, the current president of the Philippines is Rodrigo Duterte. He took office in 2016, and he instated a drug war as one of his first policies when he took office. And so today we have seen over 30,000 deaths in this drug war. We have seen attacks against activists and lawyers and teachers and human rights workers, as you said, over these past years. But just in this past week, starting on the day of Halloween, October 31st, we saw a huge intensification against human rights workers, in which over 60 people were arrested, and of these people were union leaders and labor leaders. So that's the current climate that we're in right now. We're just, people are still scrambling to figure out what's going on, and people are still currently held in jail right now.
Okay, and what are some of the activities that these organizations are doing? Why is the Duterte administration targeting them for this vicious repression?
Yeah, so some of the organizations that were targeted was Gabriela, which is a women's organization fighting for especially like peasant women, urban poor women, to fight for like fair wages and things of that nature. They also attacked Bayan organizations' offices, which is our umbrella organization is Anak Bayan Chicago. They attacked different labor union groups like Kilusan Mayo Uno or the May 1st movement. And the reason that they're attacking these organizations is because they are outright in speaking for the rights of workers and speaking for the rights of women. And oftentimes Duterte, the President Duterte, is actually targeting these groups to say that they're terrorists for speaking out against what he's doing.
Okay, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about all of that in a few moments, but before we do, I'd like to call your attention to a very important activity coming up at the latter part of this month here, and if one of you could tell a few people about what's going on, this rally on human rights, democracy, and community control of the police. Say a few words about who's going to be speaking, what the gathering's about.
Sure, yeah. So we'll be attending this rally on human rights and democracy and community control of the police. It's coming up on November 22nd. We'd love to invite everyone to come. It's going to be really a momentous and historic occasion. We're expecting probably more than 500 to maybe 1,000 people on the streets that day. Angela Davis will be speaking that night. We'll also see political prisoners from the Palestinian movement, the Puerto Rican movement speaking. We'll also have one of the spokespeople of Bayan USA coming here to talk more about the human rights situation in the Philippines. And so this is really about protecting our democratic rights, protecting people against police violence, and especially like in the cases in Chicago of even torture. And so connecting that on an international scale. So we're really excited to attend that, as well as the conference. That's the National Refounding of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression that following weekend.
And that's going to be happening at the Chicago Teachers Union Center at 1901 West Carroll Street. That's just a handful of blocks away from the green and pink L lines on the near west side. So please check that out. We'll get that graphic up for you in just a few moments as well. But back to our conversation, specifically dealing with the Philippines. The situation with President Duterte, some of the things that he has said, I read out at the rally last night. He said, quote, Hitler massacred 3 million Jews, was actually 6 million. Now there are 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them, end quote. He also said, quote, if Germany had Hitler, the Philippines have, me, end quote. That's what he said. And for all the horrible things that Donald Trump has said, and there have been many, that is such an incitement to violence. And he was saying these things. I think it's important to know this isn't just a Trump administration phenomenon. After the overthrow of the Marcos dictatorship in 1986, a few years later, people in the Philippines were so incensed and were so organized that they were able to force the long-standing U.S. military bases out of the Philippines. But it was under President Obama that those troops came back in, and the military aid really started flowing in. At any given time, there's as many as 5,000 U.S. troops stationed in the Philippines, and people don't know that fighting a dirty war, especially in the south of the country. In 2016, the Obama administration gave Duterte's drug war $32 million, in addition to $26.5 million in military aid. And this all precedes the quite horrible Trump administration, which has continued to do more and more and given even more encouragement to Duterte to do these attacks. So it's important to realize that this is the problem of U.S. support for neocolonialism and dictatorship is a bipartisan problem. Now, I don't know what districts you live in, but I'm curious to know what interactions, if any, Gabriela Chicago or others have had with the Chicago congressional delegation in terms of the apparently bipartisan support for Duterte. Tell us about that.
So, I mean, just to elaborate on your point, under Duterte, we have seen a lot of U.S. support for this militarism and dictatorship, for the military rule that we see in Mindanao and Negros, Bicol, and Samar, which are different islands in the Philippines. Basically, some of the government officials went to Duterte and said, "We approve of your drug war. We'd love to implement it in the United States." And so, 195 million of our tax dollars are going towards this bloodshed currently. What we do as Malaya Movement is that we actually have done a lot of congressional visits. Back in April, we visited over 100 congressional offices. And so we were really advocating for a Congress hearing on the human rights situation in the Philippines, and we won that very recently. So it's really exciting to see that on a nationwide scale that human rights in the Philippines is being discussed. But we definitely need to push for more. We need to push to literally stop all of the U.S. aid to the Philippines until this violence stops.
And what I'd like to shift gears a little bit now, because a lot of what sort of kicked this off and how Duterte gained popularity was his so-called war on drugs. And we're going to put a few quite disturbing pictures, not extraordinarily graphic, but certainly graphic enough, up on your screen. For those watching on Facebook Live, sorry, you're not going to be able to see these, but they'll be posted on YouTube later. As mentioned earlier, I believe it's at least 20,000 have been murdered in the so-called war on drugs. And it becomes almost, it's a daily occurrence. And as in this country, people take drugs for a variety of reasons, but one of the most, unless you're rich and just dissolute, if you will, one of the main reasons is your life is pretty horrible. And the poverty in the Philippines, thanks to things like the decades-long Marcos dictatorship and the disinvestment that caused, means that a lot of people are in very desperate situations. And plus, the Philippines has been hit by repeated hurricanes of the most horrible, really one of the biggest ones in history. Hit just last year, I believe it was, and devastating people who already didn't have a lot. I think it's important to know that context, but people, as you can see, are fighting back, so there is hope. This was a memorial march held after the murder of a 17-year-old, and so it's people are organizing. They're not just taking it. There's some pictures of your compadres in the Philippines. Another picture of Gabriela in the Philippines, I believe. So people are indeed organizing. And just before you we get back to the regular screen here. If you want to get in touch with Gabriella USA, that is their website, gabriellausa.org. Very easy to remember. And we'll get that up on the screen towards the end of the show as well. So the situation right now, dozens of attorneys have been murdered. I understand there's some hope that the judicial system might possibly rein in Duterte, but what's going on with that?
Well, what we're seeing right now is the reason that these arrests happened in a short period of time and so frequently is there was one judge in Quezon City, which is located in the Metro Manila region of the Philippines, ordered all of these arrests all in one day. And the geography of the Philippines is that most of the arrests actually happened on a completely separate island that's hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away from where this judge is actually based. So she was able to sign warrants for arrests of people not even within her district or within her her judicial area. And so that just shows us that the Philippine National Police, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and the Duterte regime understand who their allies are in the judicial system. Otherwise, they would have gone to a judge that was near into their geographical area.
I see. Yeah,
but they went to someone who they knew that they could ally with. And
passed down the indictments and
yes.
Exactly.
So, how are people fighting back? What's sort of organizing? Are there strikes? Are there protest marches? I mean, you think of just the incredibly dangerous situation that activists, anyone who's seen as prominent, risk being killed. How do people organize?
Yeah, people have been organizing since the Marcos dictatorship, and the movement has only grown stronger, especially under the current conditions under President Duterte. And so the reason why these particular organizations have been hit is because they have been so organized for decades, and their leadership and is known in the community. It's known by the government to be strong and to be able to build people power. So this wasn't just an accident. It didn't just happen overnight. These people have continuously been targeted by several different administrations, even preceding Duterte, for the kind of organizing that they do on the ground. And so what Bayan is a part of, what Anak Bayan and what Gabriela is a part of is called the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines. We push for national sovereignty of the Philippines for the majority, for the masses of the people, which is why we call ourselves national and democratic. And so our whole entire movement has been labeled as terrorist or communist fronts as a way to delegitimize our calls for genuine democracy and sovereignty in the Philippines.
Well, it's very interesting that you bring up the issue of national sovereignty because under the Obama administration, there was this so-called tilt towards Asia. I can't remember the specific phrase, but this whole idea that the Obama administration and subsequent administrations were going to do what they could to control East Asia, seeing China as a rising threat. And Duterte, I understand, has done some overtures to China to try and balance the United States. And it becomes a tricky thing, balancing between two superpowers. Well, what do people's movements say about that? Because you look at what's going on in China and Hong Kong. There's a lot of repression there too. So, and obviously the United States repression has been many decades long. And how do the people movement deal with those sort of conundrums?
Yeah, I'd say that in the Philippines and the Filipino movement, people are outright against any threats to our sovereignty, whether that's China or the United States. And so actually there was a case recently, just like a couple months ago, where a Chinese ship sunk a Philippine ship and then left those people to drown. And that is a direct threat on our sovereignty. That is a disrespect to the people of the Philippines to leave people in that kind of situation. And that was happening in the West Philippine Sea, which is a debated territory of China or the Philippines, right? But we say that, these are our waters, these are our seas. Why is it that China can just come in and have this type of violence towards the Filipino people? So regardless, we'll continue to rise up. We'll continue to fight back against those things. And
at the same time, a lot of people don't know it, but there are, I believe, a few hundred U.S. bases in the region. So it's China, there's a lot of coverage in the press here in this country about, China's, building on this reef or on this atoll or whatever, trying to establish its control. The United States is, the fleets are going through there with their aircraft, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier and nuclear-tipped missiles and so on and so forth. So it's sort of like, there's an old African proverb, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And the people of the region risk being in the middle of this conflagration of these two superpowers that really don't have anyone's interest in mind except for their own and their own profits. So in terms of the, I think, the trajectory of getting Duterte, of getting people like Orban in Hungary, who's a very right-wing, nasty figure, not unlike Duterte and Trump. We've had this situation where these leaders have come to power, and one of my arguments with left activists in this country is, well, what is it that preceded it that laid the basis for someone who's just so openly vile as Trump or Duterte? What is it about previous administrations not meeting people's needs? And some people just go crazy and say, oh, anything is better. I mean, any authoritarian figure. Tell us about the run-up to Duterte and what paved the way for Duterte, because he's obviously such a horrible figure praising Hitler and so forth.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, if we look at previous administrations before Duterte, we saw similar accounts of killings, of extrajudicial killings. We saw so many political prisoners, killings of peasants. There's been massacre after massacre because it's a worsening economic crisis in the Philippines that we're seeing, that they constantly have to suppress the people. So the administrations beforehand, like President Aquino, he does it with a happy face, right?
Sounds
doesn't
familiar.
doesn't say the things that Duterte is saying, but the effect is the same. We see the conditions have remained the same actually since the time of our colonization, since they instilled this fake independence, right? Actually, Aquino came to Chicago and was meeting with Rahm Emanuel about investments in the Philippines. And so we can already see the level of corruption and how intertwined it is with what's going on in the U.S. government itself.
Well, in the situation of poverty in the Philippines, you only get a glimpse from a few of those pictures we put up on the screen there, but the poverty is truly massive because the Philippines, unlike India, unlike the so-called four tiger economies, it was a large economy before Marcos took power with U.S. help, and then basically the country sat still or regressed economically while Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea all got much richer. And then you combine that with the devastating series of natural crises, some which aren't so natural when you think about climate change. Talk about the situation with poverty that people are facing, what unions are fighting against and so forth.
So right now, you mentioned earlier that there are 10 million Filipinos that reside outside of the country, outside of the Philippines. So we see just a huge exodus of Filipinos leaving the country every single day due to the dire conditions, the joblessness, the poverty, the landlessness. So 6,000 people have to flee the Philippines every day just to find work. And actually, one of the largest exports of the Philippines is people. It's labor power, and that's. We're all over the globe for that reason.
A lot of merchant seamen, for example, a lot of people working the worst jobs in the Gulf states are Filipinos who are just desperate to get any kind of work.
And that leads to a lot of things like human trafficking, which we see even in this city, right? Of Filipinos who come here through really poor agencies that then they have to take out a ton of loans to come here, and then they're living in quarters where there's 10 people, right? So really the situation, the poverty that we see is 1 in 5 people in the Philippines are living in extreme poverty, meaning they don't have enough to eat, they're dying of malnutrition, they're dying of basic diseases that we've already found cures for. right?
Well, we've talked about all sorts of different kinds of repression, but Gabriela, the Philippines as well as in the United States, you focus on gender-based violence. And I wish you could say a few words about your organization and the kind of work you're doing to defend women and families in the Philippines and in the diaspora. Could you say a few words about the work and the conditions that you're facing, that you're fighting against?
Yeah, so I mean, Gabriela has been doing a lot of great work around gender-based violence, has been doing work especially for impoverished families, mothers and children. Some of the things that we do is especially like urban poor organizing back in the Philippines, protecting families from demolitions and things of that nature. Also, one of the biggest campaigns that Gabriela USA has done is actually fighting for justice for Jennifer Lade, who's a trans Filipino woman who was murdered by a U.S. Marine. And so, ultimately, we see that the problem of militarization in our country, of having U.S. forces in our country, leads to gender-based violence such as that, right? Leads to the economic crisis that forces people into things like prostitution. And so we constantly are still fighting that campaign because he still hasn't seen justice. The U.S. Marine Scott Pemberton still hasn't actually been brought to justice.
And this is something that you see around U.S. bases around the world that, I mean, how would we feel if there were thousands of foreign troops right on the edge of Chicago, and as if that wasn't bad enough, there was a lot of gender-based violence and other violence committed by these troops. And you see this in U.S. bases right around the world, and we literally have hundreds of bases. The United States is truly an informal empire, and that is devastating to the peoples of other countries. We've seen it in the Philippines. We've seen it around the world. And it's also devastating to people here, not just in terms of veterans coming back and being so screwed up, but all the promises that the Democratic candidates are now making about free health care, about free higher education, et cetera, et cetera. There's a reason why we don't have these things.
Exactly.
It's with the military.
Yeah.
We spend as much on the military in this country as almost the rest of the world combined. And it directly hurts people in the Philippines.
Right. And just to add to that point too, one of the threats that Duterte made is that if the army ever sees a Filipino rebel, that they should shoot them in the vagina. And that actually was carried out. So his words of violence against women have actually been carried out by the military itself.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Maya and Arcelia, and Hillary, I should say. And I just want to call people's attention again to this very important action coming up at the end of this month here. This is, again, a rally on human rights, democracy, and community control of the police. Renowned human rights activist Angela Davis and a host of others are going to be speaking at this event. So please make the time to come to the Chicago Teachers Union headquarters at 1901 West Carroll Street, 7 to 9 p.m. on Friday, November 22nd, just a couple Fridays from now. Check that out. It's very important for moving our own struggle here as well as our international struggles forward. And with that, I'd like to thank again Maya and Hillary. You guys have been great. This is the sort of program that should be on major broadcast networks, but unfortunately, they're not covering it, and yet there's so many people in this country who have ties back to the Philippines, and we should be concerned about what's happening around the world, regardless of whether or not that was the case. So with that, I'm Andy Thayer with the Gay Liberation Network signing off, and we'd like to just close out thanking the people who made tonight's show possible.